Thank you, Selena. Appreciate it. We want to thank the National Immigration Forum and everyone else for supporting this program. The Asian American Bar Association, represented by my colleague Singh, sitting right over there. I also want to acknowledge Marty Goosen, who co-chairs with me the Policy, Business and Policy Committee. Marty, thank you for being here and bringing your better half. And I saw someone that should be introduced that walked in, Brett Perlman. Did I see? There he is. Brett is the new executive CEO of the Center for Houston's Future. And as Michael Jen knows, they are focusing, they're going to make a big focus on immigration policy. And so we're looking forward to working with you as well. So this is a hot topic, immigration. We're living in a new era of extreme vetting, the Trump administration. Although, in fact, immigration has been a challenging topic for decades. Trying to pass immigration reform it has proven to be very difficult. Even small bore immigration reform has been difficult. Texas used to be a state that sort of led the nation in terms of enlightenment on immigration in some ways. I remember in 1996 when Governor Bush admonished candidate Pat Buchanan, he was welcome to come to Texas as long as to campaign for the Republican nomination, as long as he didn't bash immigrants. And then our own Governor Rick Perry signed a unanimously passed, I think with one vote, the so-called Texas Dream Act. All the Republicans voted for it. And Texas has shifted, like the country, remarkably for a variety of reasons maybe we can get into on immigration. So we're going to talk about immigration broadly and some of the hot button issues. So, and I will comment as well. I'm not going to miss that opportunity. So let me introduce, as I call upon them so you remember, the first to my left, Ann Chandler, who I've known for many years. She's an executive director of the Tahirih Justice Center that focuses on the rights of immigrant women and children, and they played a very important role, particularly with the so-called unaccompanied minors. And she's written and has been quoted and is very involved in everything dealing with immigration. But let me go ahead down the road because I'm actually going to go to Holly first. Then to her left is Beto Cardenas. I sort of feel like I'm almost a godfather to Beto because in some ways I got Beto here. He was at that time working as general counsel for our U.S. Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, and we had set up Americans for Immigration Reform, a 501c3 through the partnership, and so we hired Beto away from Senator Hutchison, and he came to work for us sort of through the law firm of Vinson Elkins, where he's counsel there, and he's been very active on immigration issues. It comes naturally because he's from Laredo, Texas, and maybe he can comment on that. And he has been quoted widely. He's on television. He became a regular on Fox Business News with Lou Dobbs tonight. So he was, for the most part, I understand, taking the right position. Not necessarily the right position, but the correct position. All right, and finally, my friend Ali Noorani. Ali, by the way, I will remind you several times, has just written a great book, There Goes the Neighborhood, How Communities Overcome Prejudice and Meet the Challenge of American Immigration. And so it's Jorge Ramos, and some of you would know who that is, because it's an essential book to understand the fear, challenges, and opportunities on both sides of the immigration debate. So it just happens to be for sale outside, so Ali didn't want me to do this, but I promised him I would push his book anyway, and it's a good one. So he is the executive director of the National Immigration Forum. By the way, this is the second time we've been honored, the Asia Society, to host the National Immigration Forum. It's an advocacy organization promoting the value of immigration and immigrants. And again, like the others, he's been widely quoted in the newspaper. He's a regular on various television, news media outlets, and speaks daily on these immigration issues. So let me start with you, Ali. So I think there's probably a lot of interest today about DACA and the Dreamers and some issues, but why don't you try to put that in perspective, because I always like to say that that Americans don't really quite get it because of all things. We know something about healthcare and tax policy and everything else, but we don't know anything about our own immigration system, just how restrictive it is. So why don't you give a broader view?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I really want to thank the Asia Society. It's just an incredible facility that you have here that's open to so many different types of events, and I can't go any further than at this moment, because as I was walking up and I'm on my phone and I look at the posters for upcoming performances, I see a poster of my sisters performing here next spring. So I'm going to set a very low bar, but I encourage you to come back next April, if not many times between. In any case, the nation's broken immigration system. It's clear, I mean, I think everybody in this room realizes that our immigration system is not serving the needs of our workforce, our economy, our public safety, our families. And the question is, the question we often pivot to is, okay, from the policy perspective, how do you solve this problem? Well, I think the policy contours are there. In 5 minutes, the four of us could come up with a compromise that, Republicans and Democrats could probably agree to if nobody ever knew what they voted for. In fact, it would probably come back unanimous. I think the bigger challenge for the nation's immigration debate is that we as advocates misunderstand it. I think we believe that the nation's immigration debate is about policy or politics. In reality, I think for the majority of Americans, the nation's immigration debate is about culture and values. So when somebody is moving to Pasadena or Waco or El Paso, the first question of somebody who's born there and been there for generations is my culture going to change? Are my values going to change? Is my neighborhood going to change? So I think from an advocacy perspective, yes, we want immigration reforms that serve the undocumented, that create a functioning legal immigration system that keep us safe. But in order to get there, I think we need to reorient ourselves and the way that we are communicating and engaging the American public, and stop trying to make the case that this is about changing demographics and changing politics and the right policy. It is about the idea of America and what and how that idea changes as we move through the future.
Very good. And we're going to probably, before we're over with, get to some of the politics and get into some of that as well and why it's been so difficult. But let's, just as I said and Ali's saying, the one thing that's really often missing in the debate is that we have a very restrictive immigration system. People often talk about, why don't the people just get in line? And I've gotten accustomed saying the following. I said, that's like saying Harvard Business School. Why don't you just get in line and you'll get in, eventually you'll get in Harvard Business School. No, Harvard Business School accepts a limited number of people and they have very high standards. So you could say that's our immigration system. But let me turn to you, Ann. Before DACA became such a big issue, it was just a couple of years ago we were focused on another phenomenon which I think is still very pertinent today, and that is the really fundamental change of what's happening on the border. Not as many people, for a variety of reasons, coming across from Mexico, but more from Central America and unaccompanied minors. Why don't you talk about that?
Sure, eager to do so. At Tahirih Justice Center, we fundamentally believe that those fleeing violence need to have access to justice, and preliminarily at the border, when individuals arrive, we have laws, both international obligations and statutory laws, which ensure that individuals who are terrified for their life or fleeing persecution have access to our asylum laws. And fundamentally, we have additional protections to ensure that children who are not arriving with a parent or are unaccompanied children have access to see an immigration judge. And in 2014, we saw this huge spike of unaccompanied children rising to roughly 70,000. And as we worked with this population, we recognized that depending on the month, Harris County was one of either the first or the second county where the children were calling their destination and seeking refuge. And Houston responded with attorneys from Vinson and Elkins and other law firms saying, what can I do to support this population? And the way our system is set up to evaluate whether these kids may fall under our protections, whether that's asylum law or statutory protections, is it's on the burden of the child to present their case. But in our structure of justice, they're not assigned an attorney or a representative. So it's up to the pro bono volunteer community to put together those teams. And it was one of those moments, you know, in kind of the pride of Houston, where I saw folks coming out of the woodwork to do what we could. And here, you know, here we are now 2-3 years, and by no means has the violence ebbed or decreased in Central America. Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala continue to experience horrific violence, where children, El Salvador is one of the murder capitals of the world, where just being a child is dangerous. And so, in part of this policy debate, as we look at, you know, what is Congress going to do for the dreamers, for those who had received DACA and are eligible for DACA, please, it is fundamentally important we also keep in mind the youngest children, the newcomers that are continuing to arrive today seeking safety, and that we put in measures to ensure that they have full access to individual evaluations of their cases.
Okay, and as these kids come across the border, that of course created a phenomena that resulted in, I would think, an overreaction. But one of the interesting things that's missing in the debate, when we talk about people coming across the border and the numbers, as Ann indicated, a large number of those are now unaccompanied minors. They're not actually fleeing, trying to come in surreptitiously, but they're surrendering themselves at port of entry. They're looking for a border patrol agent saying, "Here I am." And as Ann alluded to, under I think it's the 2000 Child Trafficking Protection Act, they're entitled to a certain amount of due process, and so they're taking advantage of that. And so you can add all the enforcement you want to, but they'd still be, if they surrendered themselves, they would still be entitled to that.
That's right, and I think it's also important for us to also think of, you know, when we think of how the border is described as criminal aliens crossing, fleeing, but then when you're there working with the population, we see unaccompanied children. We see children with young mothers, really, who are scared, who are presenting themselves. And it really is a moment where we have to hesitate with this dialogue of let's build this wall. We need to ensure individuals who are fleeing persecution have access to protections in the United States. It's what we stand for in our principles and our morals, and it's also what the law demands.
Okay. Ann mentioned that word that you all have gotten as part of your vocabulary now, the wall. So, Beto, like me, I grew up at a formative age in McAllen in the valley, but Beto, I think, spent all of his formative years right there on the border in Laredo, Texas. So why don't you comment from your perspective as someone that's lived these issues on what you see in terms of what's happening on the border, along with what Ann said about the rise of unaccompanied minors, but really border enforcement in general and the feasibility of building the wall. And I think all of you know that Texas, not to be outdone, we've authorized this past session $800 million in border enforcement so that DPS can send a large number of vehicles down to the border, and because it's so dangerous, or that's what it said. So Beto, why don't you come in?
Thank you, Charles. It's always a pleasure to be at Charles's side, right or left, because he's quite tenured in his knowledge of immigration law, and he is correct. It is his fault that Houstonians can look at me and call me a neighbor, because he lured me over here. My hometown of Laredo, Texas, is one I lived in for 20 years, and my family is still there. With regard to border security, it has always been a component of immigration reform legislation. Many people will say that's the first step into any conversation is how are we going to secure our borders. It's often an uneven conversation because we look at it from a southwest border perspective and we don't address the shorelines or the Canadian border where you can have anybody come in if they're not coming into a port of entry. And we also don't necessarily in our country look at an exit strategy when tourists come into the country. So border security in its conversations has always had to envelop those elements, those particular components. Today and over the last 20 years, the Border Patrol force, Border Patrol agents have tripled. We have about 20,000 Border Patrol agents in the United States. The president has sought to, this president has sought to increase ICE agents, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents that would help speed up deportation proceedings. But let me give you just a couple of numbers because sometimes it's always helpful to know that. If you wanted to hire a Border Patrol agent today, you'd have to wait about 280 to 300 days to get that person through the system so that they could begin working. So that includes training and all sorts of background checks and the like. Same thing for an Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent. You've got a lag time of about that much. The conversation which focuses on border security, when we look at what immigration reform should look like, and having grown up in Laredo, the beauty of Texas, and we get this, is one where we appreciate commerce. We appreciate international commerce coming across our borders. And we want to see more commerce and perhaps less of entry without inspection. But in order to have that meaningful immigration reform, you've got to couple the immigration enforcement and the border security, those two components, with addressing the backlog and the visa system that doesn't work. In some cases it does work, but in many cases it does not. And Charles will probably lead us in a direction, and you may have questions in that aspect. And then we have to figure out what to do with the people who are already here. DACA began that process, and we're hopeful that we get to a situation where Congress or addresses it or the president changes direction.
Okay. I thought you were going to comment about your own personal experience down there. Okay. All right. In any event, let me turn to you, Ali, because you're really our star, having come by with the National Immigration Reform and coming from out of town. Beto touched on our immigration system, and we can get into that. But for the we broadly have been talking about for years expansions, comprehensive immigration reform, but now there's talk about how we might actually go the other way and reduce it, the RAISE Act. Tell us what that is and what are the prospects for the RAISE Act?
Sure. So over the summer, one of the pieces of legislation introduced by Senators Cotton and Perdue was called the RAISE Act. And the RAISE Act, over time, would seek to reduce the legal immigration to the U.S. by 50%. And the idea is to be able to reduce legal immigration by 50% by implementing a point-based or merit-based system and slashing or cutting in half, more than half, family-based immigration. Now, the interesting part about this is that a lot of times, a lot of the debate is comparing the United States immigration system with Australia or Canada, which is solely a point-based system. In this case, but we're comparing apples and oranges. When you look at the economy of the United States compared to Canada and Australia, our economy is much larger and much more diverse. And then when you look more closely at the actual immigration systems of Australia and Canada, they used a point-based system to supplement work-based visas and even family-based visas. In fact, proportionally, they admit 2 to 3 times more immigrants through work and family-based immigration than we do as a country. So a lot of times this idea of merit-based immigration is rather appealing. It's like, we're going to get the right people. When you look closely, when you start to peel back layers of the onion, we're not measuring the impact and the strength of our economy the right way, and we're actually not understanding how they have set up their immigration systems. I would argue that as the United States, much less as Texas, we need the skilled engineer as much as we need the skilled farm worker. So how do you create a merit-based system that achieves that sort of balance? And so a lot of times and this is kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning, when we're talking about policy, we're actually we're not winning the debate. When we're talking about these questions from an economic perspective, a law enforcement perspective, a values perspective, then we're starting to make a case to the American public that immigration is a benefit to the American worker and their family. But if we have to debate about policy, this many points for that type of visa, that's a lot of explaining to do on a very, very complicated question.
Yeah, there's the nice thing about the RAISE Act. Actually, there's nothing nice about it, but the nice thing about the prospects is that they're not very good, because to pass any immigration legislation takes 60 votes in the Senate. And I think almost unanimously, every Democrat will oppose that. And then you have a lot of Republicans, starting with Lindsey Graham and John McCain and others, that will peel off very fast.
I would agree with you, Charles, that the chances of something like the RAISE Act passing as a standalone piece of legislation are very slim, if not very close to zero. But, I was debating Mark Krikorian on Fox Radio a couple of weeks ago. And he said, the radio says, well, Ali and the National Immigration Forum would take a deal for Dreamers that said protection for DACA recipients plus border funding. And Mark said, that's a non-starter to us. We want elements of the RAISE Act injected into this debate, and we want to use DREAM Act legislation to reduce legal immigration. So it may not pass as a standalone, but we're already seeing elements of this legislation introduced into the conversation, and we're starting to see, frankly, the administration drive an effort to reduce legal immigration, which is, I think, at the end of the day, why the South Texas, the Houston business community, the Houston faith community is such an important set of allies at this moment, because you all are the most powerful messengers to the public and to members of Congress who are grappling with this question.
Yeah, and I'd like to expand on your comment about reducing legal immigration. I think everyone knows that President Trump campaigned on that he was going to deport all 11 million and build a big, beautiful wall. And the total focus was on undocumented immigration. But not unsurprising, at least to some of us, his administration has focused almost more on reducing legal immigration. And the RAISE Act may not pass, but they're doing that through administratively, through the decision-making process. And it's not surprising. I think all of us were happy with the appointment of General John Kelly as the head of Department of Homeland Security. But they've now started appointing, there are three anti-immigrant organizations, not anti-illegal immigration. These people want essentially zero immigration. FAIR, Federation of Americans for Immigration Reform, nothing fair about FAIR. The Center for Immigrant Studies, their so-called think tank, and Numbers USA. They're all three really affiliated, and they are, in the end, they want essentially zero immigration. And what's scary is, if you look at the appointments, their highest level people are being appointed to policy positions in the various immigration agencies. And it's like putting the proverbial foxes into the hen house. All right, enough. Let's go to what maybe many of you are here and most concerned about, and maybe the most interesting part of this discussion. On September 5th, President Trump sent out Jeff Sessions to rescind DACA. So why don't you tell us your thoughts about this, and I'll let everyone speak on that topic.
Yeah, sure. So, Houston is home to roughly, based on statistics produced by the Migration Policy Institute several years back, roughly 575,000 individuals who are undocumented. And of that population, an estimated roughly 60,000 individuals who are eligible for DACA. The vast majority, which at some time did receive DACA. And so this rescission goes to the core of individuals in our community who are our colleagues at work, who are our friends, our neighbors, our loved ones. And it goes to the testament of, what are we about? And so one thing about Jeff Sessions' announcement is that he chose to do it under an umbrella of the rule of law. And to me, that was very disturbing. I think we've had a lot of conversation here about the large amount of funding that Congress has passed historically for border control. I think what we haven't mentioned in this conversation is the complete gutting of funding for the administration of justice, whether that's the benefits arm of immigration, the citizenship of immigration services, or our immigration judges. So at Tahirih, when we're working with survivors of trafficking, domestic violence, sexual assault, timing is sometimes everything. When you have a child who's in a dangerous situation abroad and you can't even get to an immigration judge for 4 years to have your case adjudicated because the judges are being moved to detention centers to rapidly remove individuals, this is not what we stand for. And so I'm shocked and appalled by the decision personally and professionally. And I hope that we do it as a catalyst of a very deep and larger conversation for how can we respond with a larger umbrella of what I think is the rule of law, is expanding fundamentally the number of individuals who have a legal pathway to remain.
If I could piggyback on that, and looking at your question, Charles, what does the DACA situation mean for Houston? And of course the topic, what does immigration reform mean for our state, our country, and our city? Let me bring it home to Houston and give you a perspective as a pro bono attorney that's done a lot of work like Charles Foster does and the advocacy that Ali does in partnership with Tahirih. In Houston, we do have those tens of thousands of students who have already populated and matriculated through the DACA system. If you got your application in by September the 5th, it would be considered, assuming that everything was in check. If your status expires before March the 5th, you have until October 5th to renew it. And if you're not within that window, you're out of luck. If you had the 2-year status and it expired already, you cannot renew it. What does this mean for our economy? A lot of things. First off, let's take the moral issue here. And having met with a lot of families, their parents, and the kids who are impacted by this, let's take the kids who are already in status or going into status. The government knows what their address is. There's a fear among those families that the children who currently have DACA could be uprooted. There's always the fear that the parents and other family members could be deported and separated from the family. So you have that moral cloud, I think, that hangs in the balance. But more intently, within our economy, our schools could be disrupted with a lot of these students that are currently in high school and in community colleges and universities. Most of these kids end up getting the work authorization so that they can work legally, pay taxes, and so you would have a displacement of that entry-level or professional-level workforce. In addition to that, what you can see in the long term is individuals who, one congressman said, well, they can go back and live in the shadows. Well, what does that do when you were working legally and now you have to go work in an underground economy? Your taxes aren't being collected at the federal level, much less a state level. Maybe you have a state sales tax and property taxes and cigarette taxes or anything else, but you don't have that tax base that is going in on a legal method. So your industries are impacted. Let's also keep some other facts in mind. If you're in DACA, you have to submit to biometric identifiers. What I mean by that is your fingerprints have to be in a registry. You cannot commit any crimes other than maybe a traffic violation or two. In addition to that, you're only good here for a 2-year period of deferred action on your possible deportation. So why would you submit to this? And the reason is that you want to be part of a community. You want to be able to move forward. I have hope that we will be able to get somewhere. We can talk in further detail about the complexities of how we get there. I agree with what Ali and what Charles indicated about the negotiations that can go forward. Having spent time yes, as a general counsel to one of our former U.S. senators who served with high regard and left with high regard, I would say it's never easy to find the middle ground. We tried really hard to do it when I was on her team, and I think we got somewhere. Somewhere so much that the current Vice President of the United States was our partner in our legislative proposals. Where things go is always up in the mix.
I would only add one thing. So the Deferred Action Program is incredibly important for 740,000 young people and their families, right? And there's no disputing that. I would argue that the program is just as important for millions and millions of Americans who, for the first time, have realized that their child's best friend is undocumented, that the family one pew over at church is undocumented, that the family down the street that they shared a barbecue with is undocumented. So almost regardless of what happens with this legislative fight, those millions and millions of Americans are never going to be able to unremember that. And so therefore, in this crisis, is a pretty incredible opportunity, because more people are paying attention to this question than probably ever before. And therefore, I think we have a real opening to make the case to the American public that immigration and immigrants are a net benefit to the American worker and their family. Because if left to the opposition's arguments, the RAISE Act, at certain moments of the administration, they will be led into a place where they believe that immigrants and immigration are a net negative to their lives. So there is an opportunity here.
I'd like to sort of do a little commercial break here. Maybe, hopefully, some of you, if not many of you, would share our feelings that it was discouraging when the Trump administration rescinded DACA. There was a silver lining. He promised to do it on day one, and he not only didn't, he waited some period of time, and then he didn't do it immediately. He, as Beto outlined, he gave it, you can be in status over a period of time. You simply cannot extend beyond the March 5th date. But the president did one more thing. He, to his credit, and I didn't think I'd ever use those words, he did say something very positive. He said, we need a legislative solution. So here's the commercial break. If our congressional delegation, if our senators are ever going to vote on any piece of immigration legislation beyond border enforcement, this should be it. This should be the lowest of the low-hanging fruit, the easiest vote. The legislative solution is some form of the DREAM Act. The bipartisan one is the DREAM Act of 2017, introduced by Senators Graham and Durbin. It's a good piece of legislation, and that should be the easiest thing, even if it has to be paired with something as indicated, as long as it's not too much to ask for. But some additional border funding might be an appropriate price to pay for that. So if you're concerned, contact your congressman, and not to be partisan. There's one of the two parties that tend to vote against all immigration reform legislation. The other one tends to vote more or less for it. Okay, I'm going to ask one more issue, and then we're going to get to comprehensive immigration reform and the difficulty of passing, maybe the theme of your book, how do you pass big immigration reform? In the DREAM Act of 2017, there's another little provision that would cover those in temporary TPS, temporary protected status. Does anyone want to comment on that and how significant that is?
Yeah, it's very significant specifically for Houston, as we have had many individuals from across the globe who've received this temporary protected status that we often refer to by its acronym TPS. And what it is, it's one of these tools in the executive department's toolbox to provide work permit and a temporary haven and protection against deportation from individuals who are fleeing from certain designated countries who've gone through things like natural disasters, political turmoil, genocide. And so countries in the past that have received it are Somalia, Congo, Sudan, El Salvador,
Guatemala,
Honduras. And so what we're seeing currently in the administration is a slow, and some would say not so slow, announcements of termination of the programs where their individuals are not being stripped, but there are clear announcements that individuals will not be able to reapply and that temporary protected status date will end.
Yep.
And so some of these individuals, while the measures are kind of drafted to be temporary, it is the practice and our experience as a country that individuals have been here 10, 15 years, have United States citizen children, are running our companies and our businesses and have been here as long-term members with work authorization and in our fabrics under temporary protected status. So, at this moment, will we be saying it's time to go back to Haiti? It's time to go back to Sudan? Is this what Houston and our country needs at this moment?
Yeah, and again, the hope is for a legislative solution. I mean, in a perfect world, we wrapped up with a DREAM Act bill as provided in the DREAM Act of 2017. But it's a challenge. It's a particularly, as these statuses expire, if they do not extend TPS, which will have a big, just almost an equal impact on Houston as by not extending DACA. When you combine that, this is a Texas perspective, Ali, with what our state legislature is doing, the Senate Bill 4, which essentially told Ed Gonzalez and Chief Acevedo, our police chief, we're taking away from you the authority because we're saying to your individual officers, you can enforce immigration laws on the street. Any person you stop, you can ask them to prove that they're in lawful immigration status, and there can be no supervision. In fact, if Ed Gonzalez, our sheriff, or our police chief try to prevent you, they can be arrested, fined, and removed from office. I mean, that's pretty dramatic legislation. The federal judge in San Antonio, Garcia, joined that, but Governor Abbott's appealing that. But here's the point. We're going to have, I think there's some likelihood the Fifth Circuit may overturn Judge Garcia's decision. But that means that every local police officer, sheriff in small towns, big towns can now stop and ask someone to prove that they're lawfully in the U.S. And the truth, there are provisions in there saying do not discriminate. You cannot do that on discriminatory. But I tell you, common sense tells me through practice, they're going to ask, frankly, they're going to ask Beto and Ali before they're going to ask Ann and me, because they'll think some guy on the beat will say, well, Beto looks like he might be from Latin America and Ali looks like he may be from Asia somewhere. So this is of great concern.
I'm Irish, Charles. I don't know what you're talking about.
I knew that. I just thought they didn't know it. So that's great. But the end solution is immigration reform. So let's get really the DREAM Act, what we do about TPS. Those are small provisions. So I started working on this issue for President Bush in 2000. We thought it was going to pass. Beto worked for it in 2006. There.
2005, 6, 7.
Yeah. So I'm going to get to Ali and ask the big question, but I have a small question for you, Beto, because of this unique. So Beto, working for our good Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, classmate of mine, paired up with Congressman Mike Pence. So how was that working with Mike Pence? And is he human? Would he support a broad-based immigration reform in some format, or what's he whispering in the ear to President Trump?
I don't know, but let me tell you about the past and how we got here, because I think that's really what's at the heart here. The biggest issue, and let's be blunt, about immigration reform, and Ali outlined it in terms of the fear concept of what our neighborhoods might look like and what change brings. In the political conversation, the biggest issue that divides Republicans and Democrats on immigration reform is whether you're going to have a path to lawful permanent residence. And what that is a green card, LPR. It means that after 5 years on that, you could petition to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. And what that means is that eventually you could vote if you so determined to do so. And that is the biggest hang-up between the two political parties. On a broad sense, not every Republican feels the same way, and believe me, not every Democrat feels the same way. And if you don't believe that, just look at the fact that the Democrats didn't bring the issue to the table when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker and George Bush was President, or even when Barack Obama was President, and they had supermajorities in both chambers. And it's not because I want to play politics here. That's just the reality of the situation. So, to answer your question on what it was like to work with then Congressman Mike Pence, back in 2005, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 4437. That was a Sensenbrenner bill that dealt with border security measures. The Secure Fence Act actually passed as a component of that, but it even looked at putting people in jail if they were sheltering or assisting undocumented immigrants, even feeding them meals. That was one of the things that just freaked us out. And it also moved certain misdemeanor crimes or civil crimes to felonies. So that caused concern among many in America, and that bill went nowhere. The Senate passed a different bill, and those two bills never got reconciled. And during that time frame, I served as our senior senator's general counsel, addressing this major issue of immigration. And what we sought to do was to find a middle ground between what the House Republicans were saying and what the bipartisan group in the Senate was saying and what the president was trying to achieve. And Mike Pence turned out to be an awesome partner in that endeavor. And what the Hutchison-Pence plan did, not everybody liked it. Actually, we got attacked from both the right and the left, which told me maybe it was a little bit okay. But if you looked at what DACA is today, the impetus for that was actually in the Hutchison-Pence proposal, which was, let's do this in a way that takes the big issue of that voting off the table, takes the red herrings off the table, and let's deal with the practicality. When I met with students from Texas, and when I say students, they were college students that were undocumented, many of whom have taken senior leadership roles in the DREAM Act Coalition, United We Dream, and others. But when I met with those students, and when Senator Hutchison met with those students, we asked them specific questions as to what they needed in order to succeed, what they wanted, and what would be practical. And it's unfortunate, I want to qualify this, it's unfortunate in a way that DACA occurred because it stymied a legislative solution. And so you're right, there is a silver lining in this, which is you have to have something permanent. You cannot have something that is temporary forever. And so our viewpoint is if you take certain issues off the table, you might be able to get toward a legislative solution. Now, that's not what I want. Personally, I think that you should have broad, comprehensive immigration reform. My standard has shifted in the last decade, and I'm for this mindset, which sounds a little silly, and I say this to members of Congress. If what's being proposed is better than what we have, then I'm for it, and that should work. How you define what's better obviously becomes the debate, but I think that should be the issue. And unfortunately, a small piece is not going to fix the bigger piece. But if we can show that the small piece works, for example, a DREAM Act, if we can show that 800,000 people are in a system and contributing the way they are under DACA now, then I think it's going to be easier to accept guest worker programs, to accept all sorts of other visa reforms.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap up here in just a minute, so I'm going to conclude with Ollie before we get to Q&A. I used to spend a lot of time talking to members of Congress about why they should do this or that and the other. And I had an epiphany once. I was talking to one of the brightest members of Congress, and he said, Charles, he said, stop it. He said, I agree with you 100%. He said, but I'll never, ever vote that way, even though you're right. He says, the moment I vote that way, I'll have someone running to my right in primary. They'll say, whatever it is, it's amnesty. I'll lose my primary. So you're right, you win, but I can't vote with you. So I was interested in the thesis of your book. I see this primarily not I think it's easy what to do. As you said, we could, 5 minutes, work all those issues out. The politics is difficult, and my reaction is we've got to change the makeup of who's voting. You think we can, you take a different approach. How can we pass broad-based comprehensive immigration reform, which is ultimately the solution?
So since 2010 at the National Immigration Forum, we've embarked on a strategy to engage conservative and moderate faith, law enforcement, and business leaders in the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mountain West. And our basic proposition has been that if you hold the Bible, you wear a badge, or you own a business, you want a common sense solution to the nation's immigration system. And that coalition has come to be shorthanded as Bibles, Badges, and Business for Immigration Reform. And what happens is that in conservative parts of, Texas or Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas, you pick your state, people see themselves in that statement. So what we've tried to do, and Brenda Kirk, who is one of our organizers here in Texas, is here tonight, what we try to do is identify the pastor, the business owner, and the police chief who are the trusted messenger in this conversation. Because I can guarantee you, as a Washington, D.C. based advocate, most people will see me as part of the problem. Fair? They're going to see what I say and say, okay, well, you're a vested interest, you're a special interest, you're a lobbyist, you wear terrible socks, why should I trust you? Just seeing if you're still listening. But when you have a conversation where it's their pastor, their police chief, or that small business owner, you can start to have a conversation that touches somebody's heart and mind. So I think ultimately it is not about demographics. The rest of the country is not Houston. The rest of the country is not California. The rest of the country is really struggling with these questions in a very honest way. So we have to find the institutions and the messengers that help people navigate that conversation. So I think that, for example, the work that the Greater Houston Partnership and the Center for Houston's Future, the work that they are doing to create these conversations and start to chart a path forward, not just for the city center, but then the region, is incredibly important. And the book that I wrote is based on 60 interviews across the country with faith, law enforcement, and business leaders. And what I learned in Houston, between downtown to Champion Forest to Pasadena to Sugar Land, is that yes, it's an incredibly diverse region, but there are also incredibly courageous leaders from these communities who are trying to forge a different conversation. And I think that ultimately it's not about the political debate in Washington, D.C. It's about the cultural debate in neighborhoods.
Yeah, my only, I like everything you say, but yeah, the concern I have always is, do we have the microphone in the terms of, because I've met with all those people and it's very encouraging, but then you have that voice from a commentator on Fox News or Glenn Beck or someone, and they're reaching an audience 100 times.
I'll give you an example of what the unaccompanied minor Chris is. So in 2014, organizations were just doing incredible work on the border, just heroic work. Making sure that these young people are served from a legal perspective, from a humanitarian perspective. But you know what? I think the Obama administration was undermining their work. They were saying that these were, immigrants who were, who were crossing the border. Like Charles, you said, these were young people who were turning themselves in at the border. So what was happening is that the narrative was becoming increasingly angry and in opposition to these women and children. So there was a delegation of Southern Baptist leadership at the national level and the local level, and Bishop Flores at that time in Brownsville. This delegation went into the Customs and Border Patrol facility in Brownsville, and then drove 4 hours to San Antonio McAllen. Was it McAllen? I think that's where they were, right? To take a look at the HHS facility. Later that afternoon, they did a press conference at a Southern Baptist church in San Antonio, and more or less said, to paraphrase, and this was Russell Moore, who was the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, and Ronnie Floyd, who at that point was the president of the convention. They said, these are children. These are mothers. It's our job, it's our role, it's our duty as Christians to protect them, to treat them with compassion. And within days, their message wasn't just the New York Times. To a large degree, who cares what the New York Times says? But it was within Fox Radio. It was within Southern Baptist Press. It was within Christian media across the country. Within days, you saw the narrative change. So I think there is a platform and a microphone to take on the Breitbarts. But again, we have to make the effort to find those messengers, and sometimes it's a matter of meeting people where they are, but not leaving them there.
Okay, thank you, Elliot. Always very, very thoughtful responses. This is the Q&A time. I only have a couple of questions, so we may be able to take questions from the audience. We were afraid that one of you would stand up and sort of filibuster, but if you won't do that, we'll take questions from the audience. Here's a provocative question from Ms. Tan at Rice University. How can you advocate for legal immigrants or even DACA recipients, the most deserving and most contributing, without ignoring or even throwing under the bus DACA parents and other undocumented immigrants? Basically, is it ethical to use the merit argument considering that others are also fleeing violence, poverty, etc.? Interesting question. Who would like to answer that?
It's a good question that no one wants to answer. So I come to this issue with, as Charles indicated, having grown up on the border, a deep sense of faith. I like the message that my faith teaches me. And I'm also a lawyer, so I look at this from a legal perspective. I share that thought, that you should not ignore the parents who helped raise the child. And in many cases, they've been here decades. We're not talking about 5 years or 4 years. We're talking 20, 25. The last amnesty occurred in 1986. You had some revisions that occurred thereafter. But for the most part, you have people who have been living here for a long time. So I don't think anybody should be thrown under the bus. As a matter of fact, I think it's a question of whether you give somebody a life preserver or you let them on the boat, and I'm for the latter. I think that builds a stronger America when everybody is included. And one of the things that I have found about our city, and I blame Charles for helping bring me here, but I also blame him for helping me get on some nonprofit boards. If you look at what the nonprofit organizations are doing in Houston to help people, we saw it during Hurricane Harvey. We're going to continue to see it for years to come, regardless of what Congress does. I mean, it's just the fact. Houston has figured it out. So, whether it's neighborhood centers, Charles, you served on that board, and I didn't take your place, or Interfaith Ministries, or the Houston Food Bank, or you can name, any nonprofit agency. We have figured this out, and I think that's what our community, and it's part of what Ali's book talks about, is going to have to do. You have to figure out how to come together.
Yeah, and I appreciate that question because I believe it calls upon us to really take this moment and opportunity. I bet many of us in this room have had the opportunity to really be touched and know an immigrant story so that we don't have to kind of fall in this narrative of the deserving immigrant through no fault of their own and the other. I live in a world where I am listening every day to individuals who find themselves in their circumstances often because their status was dependent on somebody who turned out to be incredibly violent, who turned out to manipulate the immigration system so that that individual became undocumented or made decisions regarding safety or custody of the children that created long-term consequences of living in the shadows. And I work with individuals who basically traffickers take advantage of our broken immigration system to ensure that individuals are working in our labor market without pay and with a lot of fear. And so it is an opportunity for us to really change the narrative beyond DACA to the complexities of that individual story.
I would say, before we go on to the next question, but if we can, it's so difficult to get anything, if we can get the DREAM Act passed, even though it's just a small down payment, as Beto alluded to, it might show the Republicans that they can, well, we passed that and the world didn't come to an end, maybe we can take another step and help those with TPS, and then maybe eventually get to broader base immigration reform. Okay, another question, see who wants to pick this one. How can the model minority be beneficial and harmful to highly skilled immigrants wishing to work and settle in the U.S.? How can the model minority be beneficial and harmful? I'm not sure if I understand that.
I think there's an assumption that the Asian engineer comes and they are going to succeed. That's the it's traditionally known as the model minority. I think in reality it is a misnomer, if not just a downright false. I think that Asian families, black families, Latino families, white families, they all face the same challenges and opportunities, right? Of getting and keeping a good job, making sure that their kids are going to do better than them. So I think that, and in a place like Houston, which is the most diverse city in the country, how you have that conversation about a diverse workforce, a diverse neighborhood, a diverse city, and how that diversity is then represented in leadership is incredibly important. And I think just like the previous question around, throwing the deserving dreamer as opposed to their parents. Any parent would make the decision to make sure that to do everything they can to make sure their child has a better life than them. It doesn't matter if you're Asian, Latino, African American, white, etc. So sometimes I think the media and others we're drawn into these kind of corners.
And to piggyback on that, there is a way to get the best out of both worlds. The greater question is, when you look at certain visas and the fact that certain skill sets are needed and brought in, how do you address the current people who are in the United States, who are citizens that may not have the access to those jobs? And one of the perfect ways that has been done, either in proposals, and I apologize if I sound so technical here, but the EB-5 visa is one, and H-1B visa proposals have been others, wherein you take a portion of the fee for a foreign high-skilled worker that's coming in, be it a nurse, be it an engineer, be it a computer scientist, and the portion of that fee ends up going to supplement out the scholarship or tuition reduction or something like that for the individuals who are here in this country that are seeking to advance their education, so that you're not displacing American workers. I think that's...
I would say one last thing on this is that I think we have to eliminate the language of high-skilled versus low-skilled. I think once we fall into that trap, we are devaluing work, and we're devaluing the work that anybody does. So, I think I said this earlier, for us as an organization, we believe our economy needs a skilled engineer as much as it needs a skilled farm worker. And those, in both cases, those are people doing incredibly hard and valuable work.
Okay, all of a sudden we've got a bunch of good questions, so...
You sound surprised.
Now this one's sort of... I'm glad we got this question, because this is as you would recognize, Ali, this is on the minds of people. There are many people all over the world who would like to come here and can't. That's true. We can't take in everyone, true. Why should, therefore, the ones who come illegally be allowed to stay?
So I think that the majority of Americans live in between two poles. And one pole is that we should be a nation of laws that has a regulated immigration system that has sovereign and secure borders. The other pole is a nation that is welcoming and inclusive. I think the majority of us live somewhere in between. And one day we'll wake up and we feel closer to one pole, and the next day we'll feel closer to the other. I think that the policy question, to answer the policy question, we feel that we have to be able to make sure that we are a nation of laws. We have a secure and regulated immigration system that provides the legal opportunities for somebody to come here. But we also need to have a system that makes sure that we are requiring the undocumented to register for legal status, pass a criminal background check, etc. So it has to be a both and. And frankly, the best way to reduce illegal immigration is to have a better legal immigration system, which is, again, kind of why I find the RAISE Act so troubling, because it doesn't actually solve the problem. If you're, when I was debating Mark Krikorian from Center for Immigration Studies, he says, well, we want to end illegal immigration. We think the way to do that is to pass the RAISE Act. It's like, no, man. All you're doing is making a problem even worse. Because if you have a functioning legal immigration system that meets the needs of our economy in a dynamic way, that's how you actually reduce illegal immigration.
Okay.
I didn't say no man, but, just to paraphrase.
Well, I thought that was the best part of your answer. Okay, response, I should say. All right, some quick questions here. Republicans will sometimes make an argument that if amnesty is granted, then the result would be a surge in Democratic voters which return the balance of power in red states into purple and then blue states. Is this fear of losing control unreasonable for Republican voters?
I think I can answer that one. I'm Hispanic. We don't vote. So, if you end up giving the right to vote based on that timeline that I gave you, I think you're looking at an 8 to 10 year mark. And most politicians on the Republican Party, most, not all, will say, why am I going to pass legislation that's going to essentially put me out of office, me and my party out of office? I believe that in the end, there are too many other factors that control which party is in office. Some of it may be the way lines are drawn. Some of it may be something else, economic factors. I think the vast majority in this room and outside this room would have never predicted that the current president would have gotten elected into office. And so, I don't know that that's a legitimate fear for Republicans. If Republicans are true to their mantra on economics or on social policy, they are going to find that there are going to be individuals of every ethnicity and every state that agree or disagree with them. And if they can make that argument to the voter, then I think they will be just fine. They're currently the overwhelming majority in the state of Texas, and not because, you have a flood of undocumented immigrants in this state that one day vote, illegally or happen to be granted the right to vote.
Yeah, and I always tell my Republican friends on that, don't worry about someone legalizing that maybe 15, 20 years from now, maybe being eligible to naturalize. Worry about how his children will vote, who are U.S. citizens. They'll vote. They'll remember how you vote. So that should be their real concern. Okay, John Salinger, who I know, with Texas GOP Vote, it's a GOP website, but they're, I would say, enlightened on immigration, says, maybe, Ali, you can handle this. What is the legislative roadmap at the national level over the next 6 months? Who are the key legislators to focus on?
Sure, so that's a great question. So I think over the next 6 months, let's just even look at between now and the end of the year. I think we're going to see a lot of action and chatter around a legislative fix for Dreamers. Wrapped up into that will be a conversation around border enforcement. So I think the best compromise I think we can reach is protection for Dreamers, hopefully more than just DACA recipients, and additional funding. What we would advocate for along the border is funding to improve the security and the infrastructure of ports of entry and clearing the sight lines along the Rio Grande River. Those are smart, effective border enforcement measures. That hopefully will be the baseline, and we can stick to that foundation. There will be efforts to, add the RAISE Act and other pieces. I think there could be an effort to address the temporary protected status question. The big challenge for us over the remainder of the year and into early next year is, what will the legislative vehicle be? Will it be a clean piece of legislation that moves through regular order, meaning that we have to have hearings in the Judiciary Committee and then go to the full floor? That is a very rocky road for us. Or is it a path where the legislation is attached to a budget measure, whether it's a continuing resolution or appropriations for the fiscal year? Those are the two. That's the bigger question. Ultimately, though, in Texas, the key members who I think are in a very good position on this, number one, Senator Cornyn. Senator Tillis is going to be introducing his version of the DREAM Act, if not tomorrow, next week. And he's been consulting with Senator Cornyn regularly as he's been drafting that legislation. So I think Senator Cornyn is, on the Senate side, as the number 2 in leadership, is incredibly important. On the House side, almost half of the Republican delegation in Texas plays some sort of leadership role in the House. So you've got Poe, Johnson, Carter, Hurd. These are all members who are going to have incredible influence in the debate on Washington, D.C.
Good. Also, Michael McCall chairs Homeland Security. Okay, from Concerned Citizen, this is a very apropos question, and I think a lot of us have thought about it. Does Hurricane Harvey and Irma change the terms of the immigration debate? Specifically, it's likely that is it likely the GOP will recognize the business case for needing immigrant labor to rebuild Texas and Florida for the next 20 years? Makes a lot of sense. Anyone think that's going to make a change, a difference?
It makes perfect sense, but I don't know that we'll be listened to. And the example that we have is Hurricane Katrina and the rebuilding effort that was needed in New Orleans to rebuild that city. A large portion of the workforce that was there was undocumented. They go in as contract labor, and they are not in our tax system. And so one of the headaches that we have is that the government is not able to capture that revenue, and good employers who are following the law, trying to end up hiring people legally, end up getting the short end of the stick there. I'm not quite hopeful, but I also, for those that didn't know, if you are an undocumented person, you are not eligible for any FEMA assistance. You can get assistance from nonprofit charities and other organizations, but you have to have a U.S. citizen in your household to be able to claim assistance. So I know that wasn't part of the question, but it's a qualifier just toward the effects that we will face here in our own community and the needs that many people who won't be asking for help will have.
Okay, thanks. But this next question I'm going to ask, because it sort of gets into the push factors. Why do we have illegal immigration? From Stephanie Bañez, the University of Houston. Immigration certainly will not stop until the conditions in Latin America changes, especially El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. What role should the U.S. be playing to promote development and growth in Latin America? We can't expect people to stay in these countries which have broken systems, social, economic systems as a result of U.S. involvement in Latin America. And I might say someone that's knowledgeable about that, sitting at the right hand of the president now, that's General John Kelly, who until recently was the head of Southern Command. So you want to talk about that, Ann?
Sure, I can comment on that. I mean, I think it's a good investment. Instead of that $800 million we're spending on troopers in the southern border, if we start look at institution building and building systems of justice and safety and protection and education in the countries which right now are just in turmoil, that's a fantastic use of our attention and finances. Yes, it might take some time. I think we need to address it with patience. The countries have suffered wars for now 2-3 decades, but it's overdue. And I think Senator John Kelly, to his good regard, has already convened leaders international to begin the conversations, and I think they need to go on and really be, as we're looking at our spending, both under the Obama administration and under the Trump administration, significant funds have really been on how do we keep the unaccompanied children from landing at our border. Let's invest in the southern border between Mexico and Guatemala, ensure that the kids are apprehended there and returned. And I would really love our attention to be focused on how do we prevent and improve the situation in Central America and ensure that those who really need safety in the region are able to access it.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, as we're in the year, add to add, most of my career we were always focusing at, I mean, when you talk about illegal immigration, it was Mexican, OTM, they had a category, OTM, other than Mexican, it was a very small percentage. Today, for those what we're coming unaccompanied minors, conditions in Central America. The majority of folks coming across the border, not always illegal, the majority of not coming across illegally, they're surrendering themselves, are Central America. The president's attacked NAFTA, but if you look, what's happened to illegal immigration from Mexico? The economy in Mexico grew. They had jobs. They didn't have to come. The birth rate went down. And of course, we did have more enforcement. So let me say this. Time's out. I'm going to say everyone has about 10, 15 seconds to make a concluding remark. Anything? Let's start with you, Ali.
Concluding remark. So a lot of people these days ask me, okay, what can I do? I think that the most important thing that we can be doing is turning to our institutions and using our institutions to advance a constructive conversation. And those institutions are your museums and cultural organizations like the Asia Society. Again, what the Center for the Future of Houston is doing, your schools, your churches. Look to your institutions and their leaders and in terms of being able to create these moments in these vehicles to tell the story of how Houston is kind of the surprise of the United States.
I would conclude by just saying immigration is an issue that has been with us from the start of this country and the start of this state, and it's not going to go away. We have to put an academic focus and a human face on the issue in order to resolve it. And I would, on that last question, I couldn't agree more, Charles. The last thing we need to do is rescind NAFTA. It may be popular in the Rust Belt to think about such an issue, but it will cripple the economy of this city, of this state, and of the border region. And having lived in my hometown of Laredo pre-NAFTA and seen it now post-NAFTA, if you look along the U.S.-Mexico border, unemployment rates are in single digits. It doesn't take too long for people to remember how they were in double digits, and we had, you have more border security now. And hopefully you wouldn't have an influx, but if you had an economic destabilization that further destabilizes our neighbors to the south, you will see a greater problem here.
And?
I would say let's be as active as possible, both in Texas and on the national front. In Texas, SB 4 is a disaster. Individuals are living in the shadow with great anxiety, and the last thing we need when individuals need help from law enforcement is for individuals to hesitate to call 911 or to seek help because of the conflated roles between enforcement and protection. Our leaders, Art Acevedo and others across our urban communities, recognize it's a disaster. It's not good for safety. It's not good for communities. And so I say let's be active in rolling that back, and let's take advantage of this moment of time where we really need to address a long overdue broken system.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of us all, I want to thank Ann, Beto, and particularly Ali for coming all the way down from Washington, and we hope you do it again frequently. We know we get to see you. I want to push this book. You can buy a copy of it outside. You've heard about Ali's book, There Goes the Neighborhood. And I want, on behalf of the Asia Society and Selena, thank all of you for coming, and my co-chairman, Marty Goosen. Thank you for all coming to this beautiful building we have here at the Asia Society. If you're not a member, be sure to join. Thank you very much.